Brad Balukjian, author of The Six Pack, on the open road in search of Wrestlemania. He's in town because he's got an event at Francie and Finch Bookshop tomorrow at May 21st, Tuesday, May 21st at 5:30. And if you haven't been to Francie and Finch Bookshop, it is at 130 South 13th Street. So right in our neighborhood down here. That will be fun. Brad, welcome to the Captain. Welcome to Nebraska. And well, like I said, welcome. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me in.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump into it right away. As let me first of all say, this is a book somewhat about wrestling, but I've heard you in other interviews say it could be something that people outside of wrestling enjoy as well.
Yeah, I think that it has broad appeal, right? It's really about the humanity of these wrestlers, these guys from the 1980s. The premise is that I had a friendship with the Iron Sheik, who was my favorite wrestler as a kid growing up in the 80s. Got to know him later on in college. And back in 2005, I actually left my job at a magazine to go live next to him outside of Atlanta, Georgia, to write a book with him. But it went completely sideways. The first line of this book is the Iron Sheik just threatened to kill me.
Oh, geez, it did go sideways.
It gives you an idea of how, that's where we start from.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, at that point in his life, the Iron Sheik was so deep into the addiction that he was not in any condition to work on a book. So I went on with my life, went out to California, was there for many, many years. And only in the last couple of years decided to come back and revisit the whole Iron Sheik story. And in 2022, I drove 12,525 miles all over the country to reunite with the Iron Sheik, but also find the other wrestlers that were there the night he became the champion, the WWF champion in 1983, plus Hulk Hogan, who beat him a month later, and Vince McMahon, who was the promoter behind it all. And it's really the story of who these guys are in real life, right? Like the extent to which they became their character or, didn't. And so from that perspective, it's not a traditional wrestling book. I think it has a broader appeal.
Yeah, and it's certainly interesting, and it kind of is much like your other book, the Wax Pack, on the open road in search of baseball's afterlife, which is kind of looking at these guys off the field, outside of the ring. Like you said, with wrestling, you kind of have a persona aspect to it, especially in the 80s. But I think we kind of just figure you watch these guys, these stars, whether it is baseball or wrestling or football or whatever it is, actors, obviously, and just think, man, they have the life, but it doesn't always seem to be so true, right?
Yeah, I all my subtitles, these books are on the open road. I love being on the road. It's kind of like mimicking the lifestyle that athletes and wrestlers have, right? They're just always in motion. They're going from town to town. By writing these books and talking about it from my perspective, I'm able to kind of share with the reader how challenging that lifestyle can be. And athletes are performers, right? They're out there on the field. They're playing a certain role with the public. They have to have a certain persona. Wrestling is even more so, right? Because especially back in this era, these guys were expected to live their characters 24/7. So, if Hulk Hogan went into the grocery store and someone saw him, they weren't seeing Terry Bollea, the real person. They were just seeing Hulk Hogan. And Hulk Hogan was expected to be in costume, right? Like, hey, brother, it's like, could never let his guard down. So, yeah, I think my goal with these books, whether it's the Wax Pack or the Six Pack, is to show people the people, but the real people behind these athletes, behind the wrestlers, get a sense for what they're really like. And also one of the things that comes out of that is realizing how much we have in common with them. So I think that when you finish one of my books, you probably will put it down and think, oh, well, actually, like, I can relate to that guy, right? It's, he's dealing with the same things that I'm dealing with in life. He just happened to be a lot more famous.
Yeah. It is, again, we're interviewing here Brad Balukjian, joining us in studio, author of The Six Pack, on the open road in search of Wrestlemania. And what are, I saw, you mentioned the Iron Sheik, Hulk Hogan. I also heard on another interview something that kind of caught me off. I wouldn't say caught me off guard, but actually something that I relate to is that you said that you kind of are drawn to, maybe, I don't want to say the underdog, but maybe some of the not central characters, not the champions necessarily, but some of the other characters. And that's something that's I've always kind of felt like too. My favorite players aren't necessarily the star players. And in wrestling, I'm usually kind of cheering for an underdog to eventually get his push. Doesn't always happen. But I always wondered, like, what does that mean about me that I cheer for not the non-star? Have you dived into that at all?
You can say underdog, Jake. That's
There
that's
you go.
that's
Yeah.
true. I'm all about the under, and in fact, I found that the wrestlers or the baseball players that were less famous tend to be actually more interesting. In the Wax Pack, there was the guy that I think was the most friendly baseball player who I met up with was a guy named Jaime Kokenauer, who you probably don't remember. Most
Yeah.
people don't remember. He played 4 years for the Milwaukee Brewers. He was much more interesting to me than Carlton Fisk or Dwight Gooden, who were these star players. Similarly, in the Six Pack, when someone like Hulk Hogan, when you've written two autobiographies yourself and you've had all that coverage, as a writer, it's hard to figure out like what can you say that hasn't been said already about some of those guys. But Jose Luis Rivera, who was one of the wrestlers I tracked down, I flew all the way to Puerto Rico to find him.
Hmm.
He was one of the guys they called the jobbers, so the guys that would lose every Saturday morning on TV, kind of the no name guys that would always lose to the more marquee talent. And he was someone again that because the underdog guys haven't been under the spotlight so much their whole careers, they haven't told a lot of their stories, and so they offer a lot of new perspective, new stories, new insight that you probably haven't heard before. So that's part of why I find the underdog guys so compelling is because they just haven't been asked.
Mm.
Also, fame does tend to go to your head, and so being less famous, I mean, again, in the long run, I think the guys that were less famous, maybe in later in life, maybe more well adjusted actually in society.
Yeah. And again, we mentioned some of those names. I think another interesting name, certainly more and more interesting as of late, is Vince McMahon.
Sure.
Were you able to catch up with him on in this book as well?
Well, not surprisingly, Vince did not take my calls.
Yes.
But I was able to go around Stamford, Connecticut, Greenwich, Connecticut, which is where he lived for many years and where the WWE is headquartered. And again, one of the things I do in these books is I really get out there on the road and I want to be describing the places where these people grew up, where they're from. So for example, with Vince McMahon, the WWE had their headquarters in this office building in Greenwich, Connecticut in the mid 80s. I actually went to that building and snuck in and was walking around and kind of like seeing it for myself because I wanted to know what did the physical environment look like where he worked all those years. And then I was able to talk to a lot of the people that worked for the WWE in the front office at that time in the 80s when they expanded nationally. Again, people that hadn't been interviewed before, people that had a fresh perspective. And even though I wasn't able to talk to Vince McMahon directly, after talking to 5, 6, 7 people that worked closely with him, like the TV guy, the magazine guy, the CFO, his assistant in running the various TV programming, those people gave me a pretty good idea of what Vince was like, how he ran things, how he was able to be a successful businessman, but also the dark side of pretty much most of them said that he was certainly not the most compassionate boss, or that he really kind of exploited the talent and the people that worked for him in order to be so successful.
Yeah, there are no shortage of opinions on Vince McMahon,
Yeah.
certainly in wrestling. So that's kind of funny to listen to. I know another one, Tony Atlas, is our station owner, Derek Pearson, a big fan of Tony Atlas.
Very cool.
Yeah, were you able to catch up with him? I think
Tony,
you even got a workout with him, right?
Yeah, Tony was a highlight. Just an incredible guy. Went up to Auburn, Maine, Lewiston, Maine, where he lives, and went to the YMCA with him to work out. He took me to his house. We went around town, got to meet his wife, and Tony's had more lives than a cat. I mean, just an incredible life story, overcome so much adversity, and one of the darker aspects though is that he's still at age 70, he's still wrestling, and not because he really necessarily wants to, but a lot of these guys they didn't have none of them had any retirement benefits or health insurance. And so that is sort of one of the sadder parts of this is to see these guys who now their joints are all, busted. They have to get their knees replaced. And someone like Tony's in actually pretty good shape, but at 70 years old, you really don't want to be in there taking bumps and knocking around a wrestling ring. But again, he's still got to make his rent, and so he's still out there as Mr. USA and leading the crowd in chants. And so yeah, and I was able to go to where he grew up in Western Virginia and kind of retrace his childhood. And that's what I did for a lot of these guys, is go to the towns they grew up in. So Sergeant Slaughter grew up in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. So I went there and met with his football coach, and who's still alive, remarkably, and his childhood friends. And someone like Bill Eadie, who was in the tag team Demolition. I went to Brownsville, Pennsylvania, where he grew up, and was able to find people that knew him before he was this wrestling character.
Brad Balukjian, author of The Six Pack on the Open Road in Search of WrestleMania. Also authored Wax Pack on the Open Road in Search of Baseball's Afterlife. You will have an appearance and maybe sign some autographs at Francie and Finch Bookshop here at tomorrow, May 21st at 5:30. That's at 130 South 13th Street. So go ahead and check that out. But let's get a little bit more into this book. And then I did want to ask you a little bit about the baseball book as well, because we are a sports station, and a lot of people are intrigued by that. I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts. Or I guess I see the cover for the book is action figures of wrestling characters, and I know that for your baseball book, it was kind of inspired by a pack of cards you had. Was it the wrestling idea similar to kind of those toys you played back within the day?
Those were the actual action figures I had as a kid. You can see, if you look closely, you can see all the scuff marks from all the paint and smashing them against each other. And yeah, the Wax Pack, they did a great job. So it was published by University of Nebraska Press, which I'm actually, this is an extra special stop for me to be back here because they published my first book. And the Wax Pack, the book itself is designed to look exactly like a pack of 1986 Topps cards, which is what it inspired the book, which is, I took a pack of cards and opened it up and found all the guys inside. And it was perfect. The cover, they made it, it just evokes that nostalgia, that excitement of ripping open a Wax Pack as a kid and getting that stick of gum. So when my publisher for the Six Pack said, "Hey, what are you thinking for the cover?" Because that's actually what they do. Publishers will actually ask the authors, like, if they have an idea. And I said, "Hey, let's try to tap that same idea, that same nostalgia from childhood." I mean, I'm 43 years old. Generation X, those of us that grew up in the pre-internet era, we're united by certain things like, baseball cards, playing with our action figures. So I said, the equivalent to me for this book would be getting a bunch of those figures from childhood and putting them on the cover of the book. And they did a good job. Initially, they actually had, if you don't know wrestling, you might not know what would be a realistic pose to put the figures in. So the first version I saw was like, no, that's not going to work, because wrestling fans know they're wrestling.
Yeah.
So I had to make sure they made sure that Iron Sheik had the Hulk Hogan in a headlock the right way, and that Tito Santana is coming in with his move, which is a flying forearm, and made it all realistic.
Very
and
cool.
It came out well.
Yeah. And I know that's interesting, because I know some authors get less influence on their covers, and they just go, it's just kind of what they gave us. So that's kind of cool that you were able to use your toys as a kid and put them in the proper positions,
exactly.
as the wrestling fans will know. So that's very cool. I also want to dive a little bit more. You said too, you had this kind of previous relationship with the Iron Sheik, and that he was your favorite wrestler growing up. Did that I guess first experience with him, did that, I mean, obviously to the point that he threatened your life, did that kind of take away from kind of meeting your heroes type of an idea?
Yeah, I mean, the tagline for this book is, they say to never meet your heroes, but Brad Balukjian doesn't listen. And and so that is, it's true. If you're going to meet the people that you idolize as a kid, you're inevitably going to be disappointed. Hate to break it to you, even the best, because when our heroes are meant to be infallible, right? They're not. We don't see them in the same light that we just see regular people, because they're elevated on this pedestal. When you get to know them as real people in 3D, with real feelings and real interactions, sure, there are things that are going to disappoint you, and especially the level of the Iron Sheik threatening to kill me. But the reason why I never wrote him off, or the reason why I came back to talk to him again for this book is because even at his lowest moment, even when he was flying off the handle, I always knew that he deep down was not that person. That Khosrow Vaziri, who's the real person under the Iron Sheik, is a very serious, very thoughtful, very chivalrous guy with an amazing backstory from Iran. And so I knew it was like the drugs talking. I knew it was the wrestling lifestyle and culture having gone to his head. So I always held on to hope that he would one day kind of go back to who he really is. And I only was able to do this book because I found out that he had gotten clean and he was in a much better place in his life. And then when I found that out, I was like, okay, I could work with this. But sure, I mean, I think with all the baseball players, the wrestlers, what I like to say is that after getting to know them, I maybe idolize them less, but I respect them more because I see, again, that common ground that we all have with these people, and they're more relatable, and therefore you kind of see them more on the same level as you.
Mm. Yeah, it's certainly interesting. And speaking of disappointment, like meeting my heroes, Rashawn Jackson and Terrell Farley, I mean, that's a perfect example of no. I'm just kidding. I just saw a chance to take a shot, so I went ahead and did it while they're not here. But again, we're speaking with Brad Balukjian, author of the Six Pack on the Open Road in Search of Wrestlemania. And this was kind of based around the first Wrestlemania. Is that right?
Well, it's based on not the event of the first WrestleMania, but it's based around when the Iron Sheik became the WWF champion, which was a couple of years prior. But it really it really is about the time leading up to that first WrestleMania.
Yeah.
So we talk about how Vince McMahon. No, so if we want to talk about local stuff in the early '80s, the AWA with Vern Gagne was the promotion here in Nebraska. That this was their territory, and the WWF was a regional promotion in the Northeast. And in a very short amount of time, which is what I chronicle in the book, in 1983, 84, 85, leading into the first WrestleMania, Vince McMahon went national, and he tried to buy Vern Gagne, the AWA, from Vern, and Vern said no. And so that pissed off Vince and sort of then motivated him even more to try to put promoters like Vern Gagne out of business. So I'm sure people in Lincoln, they remember, if they were fans in the 70s and 80s, they remember Vern Gagne and maybe the Crusher and these big names from that time. By the 90s, the AWA was gone. And now at some point in there, I don't know exactly when, the WWF started running shows in places like Lincoln and Omaha. And that became wrestling as people knew it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And through cable TV, through merchandising, through just really aggressive marketing, and through getting all the big stars in wrestling to come work for him, Vince McMahon took over and made the WWF the sort of mainstream brand name that became synonymous with pro wrestling. And that's sort of I don't tell that whole story, but I tell just the beginning of it and the role that the Iron Sheik and Hulk Hogan played to kind of launch the WWF and really change wrestling as we know it.
Absolutely. And one other question that just kind of comes to mind too is kind of thinking about the Iron Sheik and some of the problems that he had. Did you, as you interviewed these wrestlers, was it the fame? Was it, when these guys were typically at the top of the game where they would somewhat start to maybe have those addictions or have problems? Or is it usually kind of like in your baseball book on the path down, maybe when they're when they're no longer champion, when they're no longer the spotlight of the company?
Well, the seeds for the fall are definitely planted at the peak, right? So the schedule back then of being on the road and wrestling 320 days a year was not sustainable. And so it made it so to keep that pace up, a lot of them got addicted to all kinds of drugs, to self-medicate, to kill their pain, to have fun, to party. They had the rock and roll lifestyle. Plus, though, their bodies are taking a beating. So they also were taking, a lot of them were taking steroids to have the physique. So you have all the substance abuse layered on with the fame of just having it all. And I think that you get addicted to that. So once it's done, once you're no longer, once you're in your 40s and you really can't wrestle much anymore. You're left with these addictions, and psychologically you're left with wanting that attention and not necessarily having something to fall back on. So the only wrestler that I met with who really didn't get as caught up maybe into the character and the lifestyle was a guy named Bill Eadie who had a college degree before he went into wrestling.
Mm.
So when he was done wrestling, he was able to say, okay, well, now I'm going to go put my college degree to work. But a lot of the other guys didn't have that. So, what do you do with the rest of your life to make a living? And, again, you don't have any retirement benefits or anything from the WWE.
Yeah, it's an interesting industry, especially back then and even through the years to certainly work in, and that's kind of, to me, as a wrestling fan, somebody that pays close attention to it, is always kind of the intrigue behind it. Obviously, we all know it's predetermined, as you mentioned. Guys still get hurt. I mean, there's still a lot of physicality that goes into it, but really, I think for a lot of wrestling fans is the locker room talk, or the kind of stories that you dove into here that are just so fascinating to see what happens to the characters that we see on TV from week to week.
Yeah, wrestling will always, even though we're long past the era of promoters saying that it's real sport, wrestling always will have that little bit of mystique, right? That little bit of like, I wonder if that's real, like that storyline. And that's where wrestling is brilliant, in that it plays in that liminal zone, that boundary between myth and reality, between fact and fiction. That even if it's a show, you always want to kind of believe, well, maybe that little part is
Yeah.
true, right?
Yeah.
Or it's based in reality. And they've gotten really good about playing with the audience's emotions. And I think that's what makes wrestling so compelling, is that it's it's entertainment, it's fun, but it's pulling at our emotions and allowing us to suspend our disbelief and escape, the way that watching an action movie or a fantasy movie allows us to do that.
And it's kind of interesting too. I want to ask you this, and I could talk to you for hours because I find all this stuff fascinating. I don't take too much of your time, but I don't know how much you've gotten into wrestling as of late. But I'll just say this, and I don't mean it in any certain way, but you're not a typical wrestling man. You don't look like the typical wrestling man, and I find that funny because I think we all can kind of picture what I'm talking about. Is and going to a show with Derek Pearson, DP again, who owns the studio. I always thought it was funny because he basically said, yeah, there was a guy on my right who said, I had to explain a kind of a local celebrity, and then the other guys are just wrestling fans, the guys that you kind of speak to, and then it's kind of interesting because you sometimes have to have different conversations with people that kind of want to believe, like they might know it's not real, right? But they are looking for those angles. They're looking for those small, things that are based in reality and saying, well, this part's real. Yeah. What's kind of been the diverse crowd as writing a wrestling book? Have you run into a diverse crowd, I suppose, of kind of the I guess the smart man's wrestling fan, right, or whatever in your typical wrestling fan?
Well, two things. So the stereotypical wrestling fan is that narrative is a little bit overblown. It is actually a very diverse audience in all axes of diversity. I was at a show right at the Raw after WrestleMania last month, and I'm sitting next to this guy who's probably a little bit younger than me, by himself, around my age. And, he keeps like kind of coughing and sniffling. And I was like, oh, maybe he has like a cold. Then I realized, no, he he is crying. He is watching the show and sobbing. And it's like, so that, but I'm guarantee you, if I asked him like, hey, do you think wrestling is real? He'd be like, no. See, he knows that it's a show. But again, his emotions are real, right? So he, even those people that maybe get caught up in it, they still know deep down that it's a show. But again, it brings out those feelings. The other story is that way back in the Truman administration, which probably none of our listeners were alive for, when he left office, his wife Bess Truman, they asked her, "What are you going to miss most about the White House?" And she said, "Wrestling on Thursday nights," because at that point, wrestling was aired from an arena in Washington D.C. on Thursday nights, and she was an avid fan. So again, this idea that like only uneducated people are liking wrestling is definitely not true. I mean, but then I am an unusual. I mean, I have a PhD in entomology, and I always say there's probably not a lot of entomologist wrestling journalists out there. But hey, that's what's fun is like when you have really diverse interests, it's fun to be able to use all sides of your brain.
Yeah, absolutely. He is Brad Balukjian, author of The Six Pack on the Open Road in Search of WrestleMania. It's been great interviewing you, and you have an appearance here at Francie and Finch Bookshop tomorrow, May 21st at 5:30. That's 130 South 13th Street. Brad, thanks for doing this interview.
Thank you. And yeah, if anyone, you have to bring your wax packs in, your six packs, and come on down.